That was pretty cool. I don't know how we all thank Bob Campbell from afar for a recording, but thanks, Bob. Well done. And thanks for being there, Pat Ranald, who is our moderator for our next session on peace and international solidarity, and all of our panelists. I will hand over to you, Pat.
Okay.
I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. I can't see anyone though at the moment.
Oh. Why not?
We're all here, Pat, just talk.
Okay.
I can see you.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Pat Ranald, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people, land which was never ceded. Just briefly to introduce myself, I joined the CPA in 1973, and I was active in the women's and trade union movements at that stage and in peace and solidarity movements. But for the last 20 years, I've been active in the national and international movement for trade justice, which is a struggle against the global corporate agenda, which Perina Perezi talked about in the last session, and which actually tries to bring together a lot of the movements that we've talked about, different aspects of the movements, unions, workers, women, Indigenous movements, environment movements, struggling for trade justice, and above all, building international solidarity between these movements. So that brings us to the theme of this session, which is International Solidarity, a World to Win. And we have 4 really great speakers in this session. I'll introduce them one by one, but I'll just mention who they are to start with. So we have Peter Murphy, Beverly Symons, Andrew Hewitt, and to comment, they're all CPA activists, and to comment from a contemporary movement point of view, we have Kate Lee from Union Aid Abroad, a feeder. So without further ado, I'll introduce Peter Murphy. Peter joined the CPA in 1975, and among many other activities, he was heavily involved in international solidarity work with Timor-Leste, the anti-apartheid struggle, Chile solidarity, and the Filipino National Democratic Movement. And he learned a lot from veterans from earlier times, such as Bill Gollan, Kevin Healy, and of course he worked with his contemporary Dennis Freeney, who was a stalwart of all of those international movements. So I'll hand over to Peter. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pat. G'day to everybody. It's great to see so many people sticking to the program today. I'm speaking about international solidarity and the Communist Party of Australia, 1920 to 1991. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respect to their elders past and present. The founders of the Communist Party of Australia in 1920 were working class socialist men and women who had opposed World War I as an imperialist war and opposed conscription. They consciously formed the Australian section of the Communist International, which had been launched in Russia in 1919 following the Bolshevik Revolution. Internationalism, anti-imperialism and anti-war sentiment, mainly based on working class solidarity, were in the DNA of the Australian Communist Party. The CPA was global in outlook, but its internationalism had most impact, I believe, in the Asia-Pacific region. In the 1920s, Sydney was where the Pan-Pacific Worker was published, a newspaper for the Pan-Pacific Trade Union Secretariat, which was based in China. When Hitler came to power in Germany in March 1933, the CPA extended the anti-war thinking to embrace anti-fascism. The movement against war and fascism invited the famous Czech writer Egon Kisch to an anti-war conference in Melbourne late in 1934. In 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria. In late 1935, Mussolini's Italy had invaded Ethiopia, and in 1936, General Franco led a fascist revolt against the democratically elected Spanish Republic. And in 1937, Japan invaded China. Australia's Spanish Relief Committee sent 65 fighters and nurses and an ambulance to the international brigades in Spain. As Sam Aarons said of it, it was time to fight war with war. In Port Kembla, the Waterside Workers Federation members banned the shipment of pig iron to militarist Japan, precipitating the huge Dalfram dispute over Christmas 1938 and a big clash with pig iron Bob Menzies. The images of that were in the Indonesia Calling movie we saw at lunch. As the threat of World War grew in the 1930s, the Labor Party and the broad public took an isolationist approach, trying to ignore the international situation. The CPA gained credibility and was able to work with many non-communist anti-war groups in calling for collective security against the Nazi fascist threat. But then this internationalism had its first big shock with the Hitler-Stalin Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939. By October, the CPA was opposing the war, which broke out on September 1, as an imperialist war. Worse, the Soviet Union occupied half of Poland and then invaded Finland. CPA leaders such as Dr. Lloyd Ross, William Orr, and Lucy Barnes, who spoke out against this switch, were expelled. So the CPA's radical democracy had clashed directly with Stalin's dictatorship. But with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, it all switched back. Over 3,000 Australian communists joined the armed forces and fought overseas, following the lead of the Spanish International Brigaders. During the war, the CPA supported organisations of stranded Indian, Chinese, Indonesian and Greek seamen in Australian ports, with an eye on ending colonialism after the war. Australian waterside workers backed the Indonesian independence struggle, refusing to allow a Dutch fleet to take an invasion force to Java after 1945. In this, they had the unofficial support of the Chifley Labor government. Strikes and protests were organised against the Korean War, the Malayan intervention, and then the Vietnam War. The seamen and waterside workers refused to load and sail the Japarat and Boonaroo ships that were to take supplies to the Vietnam War in 1966 and 1967. The CPA also intermittently maintained Tribune correspondents in Hanoi, who also worked as translators for Radio Hanoi and the Vietnam News Agency from 1955 through to 1981. Harry Reid, who was a cartoonist with the Waterside Workers Federation film unit in Sydney in the 50s, he went to Cuba in 1961 and wrote and directed animated films there up until 1969, quite a celebrated episode. Australian communists were also part of the worldwide anti-apartheid movement once the nationalist government took power in South Africa in 1948, implementing racist laws and banning the South African Communist Party in 1950. The high point was the mass obstruction and trade union boycott of the Springbok Rugby Tour in 1971. A counterpoint to this consistent anti-colonialism was the CPA's support for Indonesia's takeover of West Papua from Dutch control in 1961-62. This was a big mistake made under the influence of the CPA's relationship with the Indonesian Communist Party, which had been forged back in the 1940s. The position changed to support for West Papuan independence only after the Suharto massacre of the Indonesian communists in 65-66. It was in this period, in 1964, that Bill Gollan, a really important figure in the Teachers Federation in New South Wales, persuaded the CPA to review its trade union work to challenge the constant tendency to economism. And this produced a renewed movement around the slogan, "Peace is union business." The focus was back to Europe with the Greek colonel's coup in 1967 and the 1974 Turkish invasion of Cyprus, which collapsed the Greek junta. Australia's Greek left played a major solidarity role in this period, but it was CPA support for Alexander Dubček's Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968, which triggered a tough internal struggle about the nature of democracy and socialism, and the breakaway of the pro-Moscow Socialist Party of Australia happened at the end of 1971. When General Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected Allende Popular Front government in Chile in a bloody coup in 1973, the CPA played an important role in the Chile Solidarity Committee, and later in that decade, extending solidarity to the people of Nicaragua and El Salvador in their liberation struggles. When the Timorese people called for independence following the Portuguese Revolution of April 1974, the CPA moved quickly to establish links with them and put an enormous effort into the campaign against the Indonesian invasion and occupation, especially through the underground radio link from 1976 to 1979 and the East Timor News publication. Dennis Freeney and Brian Manning played a huge role. When the Timor underground radio was shut down at the start of 1979, Dennis Freeney took some of the radio units to what was then called the New Hebrides and New Caledonia to enable radio publicity for the Ni Vanuatu and Kanak independence movements there. The CPA fully supported the Solidarność movement in Poland from 1980, which finally played out in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and then the end of the Soviet Union itself. It also supported the democracy movement in Tiananmen Square, Beijing in 1989. In February 1986, the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines was overthrown in the People Power uprising. And in August that year, the recently released Filipino communist leader, Jose Maria Sison, visited Australia and he spoke with CPA leaders. Solidarity visits were made by Dennis Freeney, Rob Durbridge and Judy Ferguson in the following years. Looking back over 100 years, the CPA's internationalism has made an important contribution to the democratic ideas of the Australian left and to the post-colonial Asia-Pacific region, starting with China and ending with Timor-Leste. The party's underlying commitments to democracy and against exploitation and war drove this internationalism. And this work is far from over.
Thanks very much, Peter. We might move on. I should have said at the beginning that if people want to ask questions or make comments, they should do so through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So we welcome those comments and questions, but we will deal with them at the end of the speakers. So we move on to hear from Beverly. Beverly Symons first became involved in the peace movement when she worked in the organising office of the 1959 Congress for International Cooperation and Disarmament in Melbourne. And she then worked in the AICD Sydney office from 1960 to 61 and from 64 to 73, including the Vietnam Moratorium campaign. She remained actively involved with the AICD and People for Nuclear Disarmament until 1985. She was a CPA member from 1970 to 91, including periods on the Sydney District Committee and the National Committee. So I'll hand over to you, Beverly. You need to unmute, right. Beverly.
Okay. Well, I'll just start by saying that I'm speaking from on darkened young land at Gosford on the New South Wales Central Coast, and I pay my respects to their leaders, past, present and emerging. As Pat said, my introduction to the peace movement was my involvement in the Melbourne Congress for International Cooperation and Disarmament in November 1959. So I go back a fair bit, probably more so than anyone else here. With over 1,050 delegates, it was very successful, despite intense anti-communist attacks by the Menzies government and in the media for weeks. From then on, I was closely involved in the peace movement for the next 30 or so years. I was 20 years old at the time and was working in the Victorian ALP office in the Trades Hall, which was just by accident, I might say. I just happened to get a job there. I wasn't a political activist at all, and I had no connection with the CPA at that stage, although I had been to a couple of EYL, Eureka Youth League events. The Victorian ALP supported the Congress and paid my wages to work in the Congress organising office for, I think, a month or maybe longer, maybe 2 months, I forget. The main communist working there as one of the organisers was Dorothy Gibson, a wonderful woman. There's no doubt in my mind now that the CPA would have been fully supporting the Congress and probably helped to initiate it, and would have mobilised its members to participate. The secretary was Sam Goldberg. He was labelled a communist by the government and the media. I don't know whether he was an undercover party member. I have no idea whether he was, but I suspect he was close to the party. Other communists I met during that Congress from Sydney were Mavis and Alec Robertson and Bill Gollan, who was on the Central Committee from 1943 to 73 with major responsibility for peace movement work. Early the following year, I moved up to Sydney and worked in the New South Wales Peace Committee office, later AICD. And Pat's already said all the years I worked for AICD off and on, but right up until the early 1980s, really. But in 1960, when I first started working in the Sydney AICD office, or Peace Committee office it was called then, the secretary was Jeff Anderson, who had been involved in peace movement activities since probably the mid-1950s. Again, I now believe he would have been close to the party. One of the major activities I remember from those early years was a radial march from Sydney to Canberra, involving hundreds of people walking sections of the route and staying overnight in suburban and country halls or in local people's homes. The major campaigning issue was banning nuclear bomb testing and for disarmament by the nuclear powers. And just to speak a bit about the Vietnam moratoriums, but of course I'm sure we all remember them well, but I will never, ever will I forget that first moratorium in Sydney on May the 8th, 1970. We thought it was fantastic that we got 25,000 people sitting in George Street, and it went from Bathurst Street down past Park Street, and we listened to speakers and musicians on the town hall steps. It was overwhelmingly peaceful. It seemed such an amazing thing to me at the time that we were occupying the streets and virtually bringing the city centre to a standstill. The second moratorium on September 18, 1970 was very different, when the Askin government sent in the police to break up the crowd and 173 people were arrested. Over the preceding couple of years leading up to that 1970 moratorium, a large network of suburban and country town moratorium groups was developed. There was widespread support from trade unions, churches, and large numbers of university students. The CPA undoubtedly did a lot to build support, especially in the trade union movement, with the slogan, "Stop work to stop the war." I can still vividly remember how great it was to see people wearing the moratorium badge on buses and trains. It was just a really exciting time. A significant CPA action was the surprise demonstration inside the Sydney Stock Exchange in July 1970, when Laurie Ahrens and Alec Robertson spoke from the upstairs balcony and showered leaflets onto the crowds on the floor. I'm sure people in that stock exchange had never seen anything like it. The moratoriums were a great victory for the peace and the left movements, and were a significant factor towards the election of the Whitlam Labor government in 72, and they radicalised a generation of activists. But after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, there was a big drop-off of peace movement activists, and it was a hard effort to sustain the peace movement. But we continued to focus on achieving disarmament and opposing nuclear testing, especially French nuclear tests in the Pacific, and increasingly against the ANZUS Treaty and continued US bases in Australia, particularly Pine Gap. The CPA had consistently supported the peace movement throughout the decades, from the time of the Ban the Bomb movement in the 50s and 60s. I recently saw a photo from the Tribune of the CPA contingent in a march in Sydney in 1960, probably Hiroshima Day or May Day. with a banner saying nuclear free Pacific for total disarmament. And that was 1960. The party's major role was to help develop a broad movement against around the main demands that would get the widest community support, such as withdraw Australian troops, end conscription and end the war, rather than, for example, calling for support for the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. I mean, many of us wanted the Vietnamese to win, of course, but the party always had that very broad outlook. That wasn't the way you were going to build a mass movement. In the 1970s, the movement increasingly campaigned against uranium mining and export. Groups established from the mid-1970s specifically to oppose uranium mining and nuclear power included the Movement Against Uranium Mining, MORM, and the Campaign Against Nuclear Energy, CANE. It grew into a very large anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s. Activist groups were established in the suburbs, regional cities and country towns. The Palm Sunday marches in the big cities and regional centres grew nationally from about 100,000 participants in 1982 to 350,000 in 85, the largest ever seen in Sydney until the huge Gulf War protest against Howard taking Australia into the war in Iraq, when I think there was about 250,000 participated. AICD developed into People for Nuclear Disarmament, P&D, in 1982, focused on opposition to uranium mining, nuclear power, and the closure of US bases. Now, I want to speak a bit about the NFIP movement, the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement. I'm particularly proud of AICD's key role in developing support for the NFIP movement. From around the late 70s, early 80s. We helped to build networks of churches, unions and women's groups which organised the huge Palm Sunday marches through the 80s. We sent delegates to the first NFIP conference in Hawaii in 1980 and the second conference in Vanuatu in 83, from which a Pacific-wide network was developed and an ongoing secretariat was established, firstly in Auckland, then in Fiji, called the Pacific Concerns Resource Centre, the PCRC. AICD began publishing a bi-monthly newsletter, Pacific News, in 1984, which I produced, which from 1986 to 2006 became the Pacific News Bulletin, produced in Fiji. From 1986, NFIP Australia organised speaking tours with Pacific activists, mainly in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, some of whom later became political leaders in their home countries. I can't remember the exact year, but in the early 80s, AICD organised a large conference at Sydney Uni with about 6 Pacific Islanders speaking, including 2 from the Marshall Islands, which had been the site for US nuclear testing at Bikini Atoll. I'm particularly proud of how successful that event was and how we helped to build Australia for the Pacific Islanders' concerns about nuclear weapons and also for their independence struggles, including the Kanaks in New Caledonia, the Ni Vanuatu and the East Timorese, and Dennis, because Dennis Freeney, tremendous comrade. I've just got to mention him again. His struggle for the East Timorese people was just fantastic over many years. And when Jose Ramos Horta first came to Sydney, I remember Dennis took him around to all the organisations, to the party, of course, and all the organisations, and made sure that, you know, he met everyone that helped their struggle. In conclusion, I'm sorry if I've gone a bit too long. My 2 main mentors in all the years I was involved were the leading communists, Bill Gollan and Mavis Robertson, particularly Bill. And I just want to pay a special tribute to Bill Gollan. In the post-Vietnam years, he was a great help to me. He was very much committed to a non-aligned broad path for the peace movement. as the best way of involving large numbers of people for an independent Australian foreign policy and opposition to all nuclear weapons and nuclear testing. He was totally non-sectarian, Bill was. A great comrade. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bev. Actually, your timing was perfect.
Oh, good. Oh, okay.
Okay, so I've just got a comment here from Serge Dorino about the Chile Solidarity Committee and the comrades who worked on it in Canberra. So we can come back to that later. But I'd now like to introduce Andrew Hewett. Andrew has a lifetime working for peace, nuclear disarmament, international solidarity and international development in both Australia and Britain. He worked for the Congress for International Cooperation and Disarmament in Victoria and the People for Nuclear Disarmament in Victoria and the Trade Union Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK. He was also the inaugural Secretary of the Australia East Timor Association in Victoria and worked for Oxfam Australia for nearly 22 years, including over 11 years as Executive Director. He was a member of the CPA from 1974 till 1983. So I'll hand over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Pat. It's appropriate. This year is not only the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the CP, but also the 50th anniversary since the first moratorium, the first Vietnam moratorium. And that was my first political activity. I was a 16-year-old student, high school student, and went to my first demonstration. I've spent far too much of my life in demonstrations since then, often for not successful causes, but for times when it was important to make a stand. I just want to make 3 observations about the role of the Communist Party and of communists in the peace and nuclear disarmament movements and organisational movements in international solidarity. First, I think the party and party members were there in the down times when there were barely movements at all. They kept the flame alight. It's reminiscent of comments made by Bruce Kent, who's a former General Secretary of the British Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and a former Catholic priest. And he commented at one stage that without the work of communists and of the Quakers, C&D would have not have survived the times when there wasn't a mass movement. And I'd say that's pretty much the case in Australia as well, though not the Quakers alone are peoples of faith. The contribution of the Peace Parsons, Frank Hartley, Alf Dickey, Victor James, they were only the most prominent and courageous in the dark times, the depths of the Cold War, Mark I and Mark II. It was frequently communist and those who were willing to work closely with them who kept organisations like the Peace Councils and the successor organisations like CICD and AICD alive and functioning, and laying the groundwork for the resurgence of peace sentiment. Their role was as caretakers or guardians of the ideas of peace, nuclear disarmament and of international solidarity. It's my observation that disproportionately the party members who focused their political energies on what became known as the peace question were women. This may reflect the relative under-participation in the paid workforce and hence in the trade union movement, but it's worthy of further exploration. But it's at the local level, suburban peace groups, which over time became suburban moratorium groups, that the contribution of these women party activists was most marked. Frequently it stayed at that level. Aside from the role played by party women like Mavis Robertson and Leslie Ebbels, they were not involved in the leadership of the peace organisations. So that's my first observation. It kept the flame alive. The second is when mass movements developed, the party focused on maintaining and extending the breadth of these movements. That was most notable in 2 mass movements, the Moratorium campaign against the war in Vietnam in the late 60s and early 70s, and the nuclear disarmament campaign of the early to mid-1980s. The focus of party engagement in these campaigns was to argue for campaign demands and slogans which would attract the widest possible support, and for campaign actions which would simultaneously build mass participation and stretch the limits of what was possible. Illustrative of this approach was the role played by party members in the Moratorium campaign. In Victoria, the site of the largest demonstration on the 8th of May 1970, the party's central role was reflected in Bernie Taft, the prominent party figure, acting as one of 3 vice chairs, with Dr. Jim Cairns as the chair. The party opposed the imposition of anti-imperialist slogans, which would limit the campaign's ability to grow and to attract new forces. Simultaneously, they argued against conservatives who were fearful of a takeover of the city streets. The takeover of the city streets, as Beverly mentioned earlier on, happened and was a great success. John Murphy, the historian who's written on the role of the Vietnam War in Australian politics, characterised or made it what I think is quite an acute observation. We may quibble or disagree with his characterisation of the CP, but he argued, quote, to a large extent, the success of the first moratorium reflected the strategy which the moderate left, particularly the CPA, developed in pursuit of public presence and influence, an open and inclusive coalition placing breadth of participation before coherence and ideology. I think that says something about the maturity of the party's approach to coalition building, and it's one of the things which I've learned from my time in the party. The party also sought to use its influence and prestige to broaden action against the war. As Peter has outlined, the slogan "Peace is Trade Union Business" had its origins in the party and is illustrated by the actions of maritime workers in blocking supply ships Japarak and Bunuroo. My third observation is that the party and party members were active in international solidarity when seemingly there was little likelihood of mass movements developing. They did so because it was integral to being a communist. They did so with creativity. The solidarity tours by Chilean folk music groups Inti Illimani and Chile Peon are outstanding examples. But they did so also with respect and with practical support. Peter has detailed the practical support extended to the people of East Timor and to the resistance there. It was linked to campaigning against the Indonesian invasion and occupation and against Australia's effective support. So I learned a lot from my near decade in the party, and probably most importantly was around the importance of coalitions and of building, literally getting into bed with people, or maybe not literally, but getting into bed with people who you don't necessarily agree with wholeheartedly on everything, but finding the things which you can unite around. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'd now like to invite Kate Lee to comment on that sort of series of historical pictures we've had from those 3 comrades. Kate Lee works for Union Aid Abroad, a feeder, the global justice organisation of the Australian Union Movement, where she's been the executive officer since 2013. Kate has been involved in international solidarity since 1988, when, following the crackdown on student activists by the Burmese military and the shootings of thousands of young Burmese, she joined with others to spur on an Australian solidarity movement supporting Burmese democracy. So I'll hand over to you, Kate. Thanks.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks. And hello to everybody here today. Greetings, comrades, and to the other panelists and everyone joining. I'd like to first of all acknowledge that I'm also coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I'm really pleased to be here to reflect on international solidarity, peace and global justice today. Thanks to Andrew, Peter and Beverly for relaying some of those threads of our solidarity history together for us. The legacy is indeed long, and probably many of you online had your own roles in much of that history. And I can see from just reflecting on a couple of Andrew's comments there, how Union Aid Abroad, a feeder, has both been part of and benefited from the points that Andrew was making about keeping the flame alive, extending the breadth of the movement. AFIDA has been wrapped up in much of that past too. At the outset, AFIDA would define peace as always with justice, and international solidarity as always with liberation, self-determination and decolonisation. And I think a critical common thread that's been outlined by Peter and Andrew and Beverly today is the role that party members played in movement building through institutions and community structures to build power amongst the working class. And, you know, it seems to me that this was, you know, the deep objective, and as Andrew pointed out in his final point, very much so the objective to contribute to movements, even if they seemed impossible, rather than the desire for direct political roles, which, as we know, for the most part eluded the CPA, and this was reflected by some earlier speakers today. Opposing and organising against national responses to war and fascism were central themes that mobilised party members, and hearing this reflection from others here today, which obviously the anti-nuclear movement was central to as well. So on these issues, I'll just reflect in brief today. While the CPA ended in 1990, a legacy of influence did continue, especially in the immediate decades following. The 1980s decade of neoliberal oppression fueled the movements against globalisation in the 1990s across Europe, and with the Seattle protests of 1999 heralded a new wave of global protests aimed at the alliance between capital and governments via the institutions like the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF and others. We saw our own S11 at the World Economic Forum meeting in Melbourne in September 2000, of course, another anniversary this year, and these movements called capital to account and in more globally coordinated ways than possibly ever before. The global justice movement, as it was known, was born. The impending invasion of Iraq in 2003 spurred the biggest global anti-war protests since the Vietnam War, and I think Beverly made mention of that. Australia saw its largest mobilisations ever. Between 6 and 10 million people took part in protests in up to 60 countries over the weekend of the 15th to 16th of February 2003. 300,000 people marched in Sydney that weekend. And of course, ex-CPA activists were central in the Stop the War Coalition, amongst others, all around the country. And again, Australians flooded the streets to oppose war. But there are too many internationalist campaigns and movements to list through the 2000s and 2010s, but the influence of many people online today and others, of course, is palpable. If we skip through to today and think about the lens of war and fascism, the energy and commitment of the CPA in opposing war and fascism is as relevant today as ever, as we know. And fascism with all its faces, racism, authoritarianism, corruption, ethno-religious nationalism, is bolder than any time in recent decades. But also movements opposing fascism, importantly, has some new faces. And I'd include in that intersectionality, the Black Lives Matter movement, GBT, QI rights movements. These give us hope too in facing the complexity of fascism today. And as we know, COVID-19 is exposing the global vulnerabilities and exacerbating inequalities that existed prior to the pandemic. And it feels a bit like war and fascism is never far from us in these COVID times. So Union Aid Abroad AFIDA was established by the passion for justice of Helen McHugh, an Australian nurse, and the ACTU president Cliff Dolan in 1983. And it remains a vehicle for Australian union movement in educating, mobilising, organising for international solidarity. But much more than that, key unions and union leaders, not only, but particularly from left unions, have been solid supporters of AFIDA in its inception and over the years, and have also seen it through the rough patches. CPA union members active in their unions, for example, in the maritime and construction unions, were critical allies in the formation stages and in the later years. Of course, of note, there's Taz Bull, head of the Maritime Union, party member in the 50s and later chairperson of AFIDA. And of course, Tom McDonald, Pat Clancy, Stan Sharkey, many teachers' union officials and activists. And I don't have time to list everybody else, but I know there would be people on the call who were family members of union officials at the time who were staunch allies of AFIDA, particularly in those early days and through the decades. These unionists not only backed AFIDA, but they, their unions and the legacy of the social movements they were part of, and many of you were part of, enabled AFIDA entree into, for example, Vietnam and then Cambodia. AFIDA was invited to support the post-war reconstruction in Vietnam on the back of the anti-war movements in Australia and the role of the union movement in that. And our work continued over the decades in that country, and AFIDA remains supported today by the VGCL, the Vietnam Women's Union, and the mass movements in Vietnam. But the beginning point of that, of course, is rooted in the political work and the movement building work of the 60s and 70s in opposition to the war in Vietnam, which has been so well outlined by the previous speakers. AFIDA, with its unionist members, in those early days, backed liberation struggles, independence for East Timor, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the Kanaki struggle, the liberation of occupied Palestine, to name a few. And you can see from the earlier speakers the threads there. Many of the same people, and if not the same people, allied movements worked together and used the vehicle of Union Aid Abroad, AFIDA, to support those struggles. AFIDA was able to build the financial resources and deploy money and skilled Australian unionists as allies in those struggles, and in so many locations in its 36 years. There is a book of our history which you can buy online at our website for those people that love their history of internationalism and the labour movement, and it's a very good read, I must say myself. I didn't write it, but it's been well written, and you can find that at afida.org.au. The struggle continues. Of course, as Peter said in his speech, the impact of COVID-19 has deepened the global crisis. If we look at just one element, the world of work, this is particularly profound for women in the global south, where an estimated 1 billion women have been left destitute as a result of job losses globally. And 60% of the world's people work in what we call the informal economy, with no floor on wages, no social protection, no regulation for safety at work. And governments in both the global north and south, at the behest of corporations, in the last 6 months have introduced legislative bills to erode working conditions that do exist in our countries, and indeed have introduced legislative agendas to attack or restrain unions. And we're seeing this happen right now in India, in Indonesia, in Myanmar, in the Philippines, for example. So anti-war today, in some ways, for me, in the COVID, not post, but in the COVID era, this means working against movements on the ground against authoritarian, if not fascist governments, Modi, Bolsonaro, Duterte and others. And in terms of how we work moving forward against these governments and against authoritarianism and ethno-nationalism in the global left, for us, I think part of that involves a clear forward shift to fight for and embrace the democratic state as the source of welfare, public health, social justice, and indeed climate justice. And just as much in the past, and even more evident under the pandemic, the role of the state is and should be our key focus, and is indeed the legacy of communism. So a feeder today, just briefly to wrap up, our work tries to work along 4 pillars of work. Of course, workers' rights and trade union development, women's rights and feminist movement development, climate justice and energy transition, and the rights of migrant workers and refugees. Our solidarity with the struggle of people living in occupied Palestine continues. One of the debates that has come up and has always been part of the debates within the aid and development communities globally, but has had new energy recently, and rightly so, is the movement around decolonizing development. And I think I've asked somebody to put in a great article and a great read by Dagan Ali from Sudan, which articulates very well this fight ahead for all of us who seek to work in the context of supporting international solidarity and international development. So I'll just end up there, Pat, and by asking everybody, if you aren't already a member of Union Aid Abroad, a feeder, I encourage you to join. There's no doubt that the legacy of us being able to move resources, whether they be financial or people from Australia, which of course is much harder these days, but it's an essential part of what it means to exercise our solidarity. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks very much, Kate. That was great. And I'd like to thank all the speakers. We've had another comment from Frank Panucci, particularly impressed with Peter's rundown of the history, and I'm sure that would apply to the other comments as well. And I'd just like to ask people listening, are there any other comments or questions that you want to put in the Q&A at this stage? Or do any of the panelists want to ask each other questions?
There was one question there from Jackie Whitten, which was addressed to all of us.
I think I missed that one. Yes, go on. I'm trying to find it.
She says, thank you for the broad and deep descriptions of the way CPA activists contributed to international solidarity and how this involvement informed the party. Given our resources, in your views, what are the priorities for socialists in international solidarity? Are previous ways of organising still relevant now? Well, I might have a stab. Like, my instincts tell me that you know, I can see I'm part of it. There's a huge amount of activity about international solidarity going on in the world, but it's very fragmented. And I think that the positive thing to do in it is to try to link the passion that people have for justice to a more analysis of the way capitalism is working to continue to create even more and more difficult situations for communities around the world. And, you know, therefore it's about politicizing or deepening the understanding of the situation. And I think, you know, we need to do, in terms of inside Australia, to deepen the political skills of our labour movement people to see the connection between their own struggles here and these global struggles. That's the sort of deepest way I think we can go, and we sort of know how to do it.
Okay, and
Sorry. I'd suggest a very strong focus on climate justice is really critical. And that's a potential to build linkages from across the globe. And we're facing, it's become trite to say, but we are facing a climate emergency, and I think the losers on that climate emergency will be the usual losers. And I think unless we can inject some justice into that campaign and build the linkages across boundaries and borders, I fear for the future. But I'd also say that I think there's on a more considered level, we also need to build a stronger commitment to multilateralism. It's less sexy, so to speak, but unless we have global institutions which are prepared to, such as the UN, such as some of the UN agencies, we have no basis for international collaboration between states. And that worries me a great deal. I think we've seen some of the consequences with the response to the COVID pandemic.
Yes, I'd like to comment on that too, because it comes up in the trade justice movement that although we're very critical of the World Trade Organization as a the way it's currently structured, our vision about trade justice and climate justice has to involve more democratic and accountable international institutions which actually enable governments to cooperate with each other. And of course, we've had the terrible example of US and increasingly Chinese unilateralism, which especially US unilateralism, which has actively undermined these international institutions. At least the Chinese are still staying in the international institutions at this stage. But we do need those international institutions to become, we have to have a vision of them becoming more democratic and accountable, I think. I'm just trying to scroll through the questions. I don't think there are any other specific questions that I've missed, but can other people spot them? Because they're not in.
Richard Walsham's written one to Beverly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right at the last one.
The last one. Ah, here we are. Yes, Richard saying, was pleased with Bev references to how non-alignment became a basic principle of the peace movement in the 70s and 80s, but this was not uncontested within the peace movement. Could Bev say a bit more about this and the role of the CPA?
I'm not sure that I can say more about it. I mean, I just think it was an absolute basic belief of the peace movement and of the party that we had a non-aligned policy for Australia. Foreign policy was non-aligned. That's what we believed in, and that that this was just an important principle that we advocated.
I think there are two aspects to that. Back in 1976, we organised a national conference for an independent and non-aligned Australia, which had about 500 or 600 people at it over a couple of days. And so that was probably the first time non-alignment was articulated as a foreign policy option for Australia. But secondly, I think in terms of the peace movement's non-alignment, one of the things that happened is that the World Peace Council, which was, to be frank, pretty pro-Soviet in its actions and in its analysis, became less critical for the Australian peace movement, the Australian nuclear disarmament movement, less relevant, and its approach was contested. So there was a non-alignment as a foreign policy option for Australia, and there was non-aligned peace movement, which I think was increasingly the norm, or increasingly dominant.
And we've got what I think will have to be the final actual question. There's a lot of other positive comments from various people that you can read yourselves, but Jeff Evans is asking a follow-up question to what Andrew's just said. We seem to be going backwards rather than forwards regarding peace and disarmament. How do you see the role of solidarity in action on this front? One positive development I can see is that the international agreement on nuclear disarmament, although it has now got off to a start in terms of 50 countries endorsing that. But does anyone want to comment on that?
Well, I think the work of ICANN that's been remarkable, initiated by Australians outside the formal peace movement, so to speak. But it's that their global success, and as you mentioned, Pat, the treaty receiving 50 countries' endorsement and ratification gives us an organising platform, so to speak, and gives us an opportunity to put some pressure on the Australian government and on the opposition. Not that I expect any movement from the current mob, but the opposition, the Labor Party, gives some focus for campaigning work around that area.
I'd agree with that, Pat. I mean, that's an amazing achievement. And so in that way, I'm not sure if I completely agree on, you know, seeing that nuclear disarmament has taken a setback. I think that's an extraordinary achievement. And I think one of the, I mean, I agree with what Andrew said also about, you know, to deepen our support for the multilateral systems and ones that can operate fairly. You know, part of what we're seeing also now is a call by others, like, you know, the article that's been posted on my behalf in the chat, to decolonize those institutions. And I think we as leftists have to take that very seriously and think about how we do that, and also defend those institutions, because, you know, as all of us know on this panel and many participants out there, in terms of our international solidarity actions and what we need to do in exercising that, a key one is, how do we use those institutions? I mean, case in point, the Philippines in recent months, Peter, you know, using those institutions. Of course, they've got limits, and that's only one angle. But, you know, there's a very serious call from people in the global south to, you know, that those institutions must be challenged in terms of how they work, and that they must be, you know, decolonized. So I think, you know, we on the left need to take that seriously as well. But in some respects, the opportunities for us to campaign and strengthen solidarity have the potential to operate like never before, simply because of, you know, the way in which we can now communicate internationally. Thanks.
Well, that seems like a positive note to end on. I'm just like to thank the panelists, because we have reached our finishing time. I'd just like to thank the panelists, all of them, Peter Murphy, Beverly Symons, Andrew Hewitt, and Kate, for all of your contributions. And in the chat, there's a lot of very positive comments about all of various aspects of what everyone said. I hope I've picked up most of the questions. They seem to pop up in strange places, not in the exact order that they come. But I'll now hand back to Brian and
Luke.
Brian, I can see there, and Luke, I can see in the corner, to wrap up for the day. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Pat, and for your great moderating of this particular session. I just want to say a few thanks and wrap up, and then we'll play that wonderful version of the Internationale that we had last night at the end of last night's event for those who were there. So first of all, I'd like to thank all the participants today who've been online. There's been a remarkably consistent 100 plus people in attendance all day. Not the same people, but I think it's a remarkable attendance on a Saturday by Zoom to have 100. I think we got as high as about 125 for during one of the sessions. It's been a fabulous day, and I think it's a lot for us to think about and take forward. The very rich history of the Communist Party has come out. As I said last night, a lot of that history and the impact that communists had and the influence, the positive influence on Australian society and history are often hidden or forgotten or ignored. Today has shown what as we called the title of today, the party snapshots of communists in Australian society. We've shown those snapshots and what rich and deep and wide ones they were. I think it's been very good too that we've had the activists from today who were not in the CPA. In fact, most of them were not born at the time that our CPA decided to cease operating as a party. And it's been very refreshing to hear their comments and also to see the respect in which the party's work over the decades has held and what it means for some of those activists today. One of the things that I think can be said is that it's very clear that among the many roles that the CPA played, there was what we now call in Search that linking and enabling role, and Search Foundation is very much wanting to build that sort of a role of helping educate, train activists, but more bring together socialist activists from a range of movements and causes, campaigns, organisations, and create a space where people can discuss ideas, politics, policy, strategy, how to work, how to be a good campaigner and organiser. And that kind of idea can be taken forward and should be taken forward, and the Search Foundation is trying to take it forward. I don't want to go on about that, but many of us after today, I think, will reflect on how we can do that better in the light of the history, the rich history we've been discussing today. So I now want to just turn to some thanks. First of all, obviously, thank all the panelists and moderators today. The moderators have put a lot of effort into it in particular. So have the panelists. I think the format has actually worked very well. It's been pretty disciplined. Virtually nothing has gone wrong all day, which I think is an achievement in itself. Secondly, I'd like to thank the library staff here. I discussed this idea with them over a year ago. They were very keen on it from day one. As we've said in all the publicity originally, before COVID, it was to be a 2-day conference type event with parallel workshops. We had identified at least 25 different kinds of topics. The COVID environment meant that we had to come back to a day, and I think that probably was about the right decision. We had to choose a number of key movements and issues where Communist Party work was reflected. But I'll say that all the library staff involved were very keen that it should go ahead. And I can't thank them enough. Behind the scenes, they've been extremely helpful, and we couldn't have held it, at least in this format, without them. And we're in this beautiful little room, which is used to be the head librarian's official office. The library, of course, as Ronald Briggs said in his little presentation earlier today, is where we put the CPA National Archives, and they do have a continuing interest, but I can tell you that they exhibit an interest and a care and attention to our archives and the Tribune photographic collection in particular, above and beyond just the average, what the average librarian would be expected to do. Excuse me. I'd also like to thank Maury Mulheron and Arthur Rorris, who put together that tremendous lunch hour session, selection of songs and so on. Arthur Rorris is the Secretary of the South Coast Labor Council in the Illawarra region, a man of many talents, and that performance today was put together in a recording studio that Arthur has at his own house. I can't thank him and Maury enough for that. We should also thank the performer of the Internationale, who performed last night and again today, way across in England, Bethany Ellen Coyle, who lives in this little town south of Newcastle in northeast England, and as Maury said last night, was dubbed with the name of Little Moscow because there were so many communists in that little town way back in the 1930s. I would also like to thank all the search members who worked, and there were quite a few of them in the Centenary working group that the Search Foundation set up and was open to all members. Enormous amount of work on the book that was launched last night, on this event and in many other ways. Carmel Shute in particular has done an enormous amount of work in several respects, but including in promoting this event today for us. I'd also finally like to thank our very hard-working Search Executive Officer, Luke Whitington, who's was never in the party, but put an enormous amount of work, and I can assure everyone, not only in an intellectual sense, but in an emotional sense as well. So thanks to everyone. We will be reflecting on today and looking at all the different questions that have been raised and how we can take it forward. And I'd like now to get Luke to put on the Internationale, and all those, wherever you are, if you're still with us, please join in. And as we said last night, this is the Billy Bragg version. The story of that, I think Maury mentioned this, is that Billy Bragg was singing at a concert with Pete Seeger in the United States some years ago. They sang the Internationale at the end, and as they walked out, the old man, Pete Seeger, said to Billy Bragg, you know, those words need updating in the light of today's conditions. And Billy Bragg took that as an instruction, and that's the origin of this particular version of the Internationale. Without further ado, thank you everyone, and we'll conclude in the traditional way with the anthem of our movement.
The words go back over a century and a half, but it's called the Internationale. But the version we're doing today is by Billy Bragg. It's his lyrics. He kind of brought them up to modern times, and that's the version we're going to sing. We're going to help you out by putting the words on the screen. We hope you can sing along. But I'd like to make a very special mention of a wonderful guest who's going to do the lead vocals on this song. Her name is Bethany Ellen Coyle. She's a socialist singer, a young woman from the northeast of England. And Bethany and I collaborated with the help of Arthur Orris on this song. Bethany sent her tracks out from England by email. We've combined them together into a song, and I want to firstly thank Bethany for her contribution to the Internationale. Let's finish this session with some loud singing when we get to the chorus each time.